It was one of those kind of boring days, The kind of day where you've got nothing to do. So you end up grabbing your phone just to kill some time. There I was scrolling through Tinder, not expecting much. Most of the profiles seemed pretty bland, really generic, but then suddenly I saw Daniela's profile. Man, she was amazing. Pictures of her traveling to exotic places, that smile that seemed to shine in every photo. You know when you look at someone and think, this girl's got something special? That's exactly how I felt. We started talking, and the conversation flowed right away. She was full of energy, making jokes, and seemed like the kind of person who could turn any chat into something fun. It was easy to keep talking, so I just went with it. Then, out of nowhere, she suggested we meet up for dinner. I was surprised by how forward she was, not gonna lie, but she seemed so chill about it that I thought, why not, right? I accepted the invite. She picked this super fancy restaurant, way more sophisticated than the places I'm used to going. I was a little impressed, but also curious to see how the date would go. When I got there, I was nervous, We always get a bit like that before meeting someone for the first time. But dude, when I saw her, I was even more impressed. She looked exactly like her photos. Actually, maybe even more beautiful in person with this confident vibe. We sat down, and right off the bat, the mood was great. The conversation was easy. It felt like we had known each other for a long time. The dinner itself was smooth, even fun. Everything pointed to the night ending really well. But it was after dinner that things started to get weird. Daniela suggested we go to her place. She said she lived nearby, and we could continue the conversation there, maybe have another drink. I didn't really know what to think. It seemed a bit fast. We had just met, and we were already heading to her place? My gut was telling me something was off, but she insisted with that laid-back attitude, and I ended up going along with it. Deep down, I thought I was just overreacting, but there was nothing to worry about. I should have listened to my gut. When we left the restaurant and started walking to her place, everything seemed normal at first. The neighborhood was really nice, with lots of trees, big houses, clearly a wealthy area. As we walked, she talked about how much she loved living there, how peaceful the place was, and I tried to relax. But even with a casual conversation, that strange feeling didn't go away. That sense that something's not right, but you can't quite figure out what it is? It was there in the background, but I kept going because it seemed silly to stop. Then we got to her house. And man, the house was impressive. A real mansion. It wasn't just big. It was luxurious, with a perfectly kept garden and those warm lights that made the place feel like a scene out of a movie. For a moment, I thought, wow, how can she afford a place like this? But again, I forced myself not to overthink it. She's probably just rich, right? Who am I to question it? She unlocked the door, and we walked in. And that's when I felt a chill down my spine. The house, as beautiful as it was, felt off. It wasn't messy or dirty, but it was so neat, so perfect, that it felt like a set from a movie, Like no one actually lived there. But I kept going, trying to ignore the unease. She led me to the living room, which was all decked out with expensive furniture, and offered me some wine. Of course, I accepted, partly because I was trying to relax, and also because I didn't want to come off as paranoid. She went to the kitchen to grab the glasses, and that's when the first major red flag popped up. While I was waiting in the living room, looking around, trying to take in the place, I saw something in the hallway. A quick movement, like someone had just run past. I didn't get a good look, just that feeling that there was someone else there. For a second, I even thought I was seeing things. When your brain tries to convince you it's just your imagination? Yeah, that. But the problem was, it left me feeling tense. Really tense. When she came back with the wine, I immediately asked, "Is someone else here?" She let out this strange laugh, one of those that feels a bit forced, and said no, that I must have been imagining things. "This house is huge. It's easy to get spooked," she said, quickly trying to change the subject. But man, the way she answered made me really suspicious. It was like she didn't want me thinking too much about it. I was still on edge, but kept pretending everything was fine. We drank the wine, talked a bit more, but I wasn't really into the conversation anymore. I was trying to process what I had seen, and, even worse, wouldn't make sense about the place. Every detail of the house was screaming at me that something was wrong. It was a feeling I couldn't shake off, and that's when I started thinking, I need to get out of here. I couldn't relax anymore. The wine, the conversation, the house, nothing felt right. And that feeling that I needed to leave just kept getting stronger. I didn't know exactly what it was, but my instincts were screaming at me, you know? That kind of internal alarm you just can't ignore. I tried to play it off and made up some excuse. I said I was tired, that I had an early appointment the next day, something like that. But when I told her I needed to leave, her attitude changed. It was almost subtle, but it changed. Her smile became a bit tighter, and her eyes, well, it was like she was calculating what to do next. She insisted I stay a little longer. Come on, just one more drink. The night's been so great, she said, but her tone, man, it wasn't relaxed anymore. It felt like she was trying really hard to convince me. I started feeling really uncomfortable. When I insisted I needed to go, she let out a laugh that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was low, almost forced, like she was trying to keep calm. That's when I realized things were going from bad to worse. I went to the living room door, ready to leave, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. In that moment, my mind snapped. What's going on here? I looked at Daniela, trying to figure out if it was just a mistake or if it was intentional. She just stood there, staring at me with that same tense smile, like she was waiting to see what I'd do next. I tried again, and nothing. The door wouldn't open at all. That's when the panic started to rise. I turned to her and asked, more seriously, why is the door locked? She shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal, and said, oh, I think it's the security system. Sometimes it locks on its own. Man, I didn't believe that excuse for a second. Something was way off. Now I knew I needed to get out of there fast, but I couldn't show I was panicking. I had to think of something. I said I needed to go to the bathroom, trying to sound calm. She hesitated a bit, but finally pointed the way. I walked towards the bathroom, but every step felt heavier because deep down, I knew something much worse was about to happen. When I got into the bathroom, I closed the door and locked it, trying to buy some time to think. That's when I started to hear them. Whispers, low voices coming from outside. It wasn't just her voice. There was someone else in that house. Now fear really hit me hard. My heart was racing, and my hands were sweating. I knew I wasn't alone, and that thought terrified me. I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police. The problem was, as I spoke to them, the footsteps outside started getting louder. Someone was coming closer. I was locked in the bathroom, listening to the footsteps getting closer and closer. My breathing was fast, and all I could think about was getting out of there. The police were on the line, but my voice was shaking as I tried to explain the situation. I gave them the address as best as I could remember, and they said they were sending a squad. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't make it in time if things went south. The footsteps stopped right at the bathroom door. I stood there, frozen, trying not to make a sound. Whoever was outside didn't try to knock, didn't say anything, just stood there. Dude, that silence was unbearable. I could feel their presence. I didn't know if it was Daniela or if there was someone else. Maybe that shadow I saw in the hallway wasn't just my imagination after all. The problem was time felt like it was dragging on. I kept my hand on the lock, not knowing if I should try to open the door and make a run for it or stay there until the police arrived. But standing still was starting to feel more and more dangerous. Then, out of nowhere, the whispers came back. This time, they were louder, clearer. There was definitely more than one voice. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone, it was threatening. It sounded like they were arguing about what to do with me, and every second I stayed there, my panic grew. I tried to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. That's when I heard a metallic sound at the door, like someone was messing with the lock. My heart started pounding. I knew that if they got the door open, I was done for. I tried to think fast. I looked around the bathroom for something I could use as a weapon, but all I found were basic items. A towel, a toothbrush, nothing that would really help. At that moment, I made a decision. If I stayed there trapped, I'd end up cornered. So, on impulse, I unlocked the door and pushed it open hard, already expecting the worst. The door swung open, and I came face to face with an empty hallway. There was no one. The house was completely silent. Those voices I heard, the footsteps, everything was gone. I didn't know what to do, but running seemed like the only option. So, without thinking too much, I started walking quickly down the hallway, trying not to make any noise, but my heart was beating so fast, I could almost hear it in my ears. When I got back to the living room, I went straight to the front door. The problem was it was still locked. I tried to force the lock again, but nothing. That's when I noticed the windows. They were big and closed, but in desperation, I ran to one of them and started trying to open it. While I was fighting with the latch, I heard a sound behind me. It was her, Daniela, or whoever she was. She was standing there, looking at me with that same weird smile from before. But now, there was something much more disturbing in her eyes. She took a step forward, and I managed to get the window open. Without thinking, I jumped out, landing painfully on the lawn. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I started running as fast as I could, without looking back. That's when I heard the police sirens. As I ran through the yard, the sirens got closer, and I knew it was my only chance to get out of there alive. Fear was still consuming me, but seeing the red and blue lights on the horizon gave me a bit of hope. I stumbled a few times along the way, but I didn't stop. Every second felt like an eternity. When I finally made it to the street, a police car was turning the corner. I was sweaty, out of breath, and I waved desperately. They slammed on the brakes right in front of me, and I went straight to the car without thinking twice. One of the officers quickly got out and came over to me, asking what had happened. Still in shock, all I could do was point to the house and say something horrible was going on inside. They told me to stay in the car while two officers went into the house. The time I spent waiting there was endless. Every minute felt like an hour, and all I could do was imagine what they were going to find inside. After about 15 minutes, the officers came back. But what they told me wasn't what I expected. The house was empty. No Daniela, no sign of anyone else. The house looked perfectly normal, like I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I was about to be taken to the station to give a statement when one of the officers pulled me aside. He looked at me with a serious expression and told me something that sent a chill down my spine. He said that house didn't belong to any Daniela. The owners had been out of town for days, and the house had been recently broken into. They suspected the place had been used by a man wanted for other crimes. The Daniela I met on Tinder was actually a man named Daniel. He had a history of setting up online dates to lure victims. And what terrified me even more was what the officer said at the end. I was the only victim who had managed to escape. That feeling I had that something was off from the start made perfect sense now. The tense smile, the locked doors, the voices. He wasn't alone. He had other people involved, and their plan was clearly twisted. They probably planned to use me for some kind of sick video, maybe even worse. But by some miracle, I managed to get out. After that night, I never went on dating apps again. I became obsessed with security, installing extra locks on the doors, checking the windows before bed. And every time I pass by that house, which still stands there, empty, with no sign of who had broken in, I feel a shiver down my spine. I wonder how many others went in there and didn't get as lucky as I did. The worst part? Daniel and his accomplices were never found. They disappeared that night, and no one has ever heard from them again. I was in that weird phase after the end of a long relationship. You know how it is, right? After being with the same person for so many years, you end up feeling a little lost, not knowing what to do with all that free time. So, I decided to download Tinder, but with no real expectations. Just to kill time, I was swiping right without thinking much, just enjoying the short, somewhat pointless conversations. Then Elisa showed up. The first thing that caught my attention was that she didn't seem like other people I'd met on there. It wasn't just her photos. Yeah, she was pretty, of course, but it was the way our conversation started. She was funny, like naturally funny, you know? The kind of jokes that aren't forced, that make you laugh even when you're not expecting it. And soon, what started out as casual chat became more interesting. Instead of staying on that superficial level, we started talking about movies, music, even more personal stuff. She had a different outlook on life, seemed like the type who thinks a lot but isn't heavy about it. After a while, we exchanged WhatsApp numbers. And that's when things really started to flow. We were texting pretty much every day. She had this different kind of energy. I can't really explain it, but it was like talking to her made me feel good, like a break from everything else going on in my life. For weeks, everything was normal. It was fun. We were making plans, talking about going to a bar or doing something together. You know, that phase where everything seems easy. I was starting to think that maybe this could turn into something more, you know? But then things started to get weird. One night, while we were texting like usual, she sent me something strange. It looked like a typo, just a random string of numbers and letters completely jumbled. Something like 54 DFJS 72. It didn't make any sense. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was distracted or maybe accidentally hit her keyboard. But then a little while later, I got another message. Only this time, it was different. It was coordinates. I looked at it and thought, what the hell is going on? It didn't make sense. I pulled out my phone and typed the coordinates into Google Maps just out of curiosity. To my surprise, they pointed to a place deep in the woods, far from the city. One of those spots you'd only reach after driving for hours, you know? I thought it was strange, but I still tried not to overthink it. I asked her what it meant, but nothing. She didn't reply. That's when I started feeling like something was wrong. But at the same time, I couldn't just let it go. I should have stopped right there, blocked her or something. But for some reason, I didn't. And that's when things really started getting strange. In the days that followed, Elise's messages became disturbing. It wasn't the light, fun conversation anymore. Now I was getting pictures, but not normal ones like selfies or anything like that. These were distorted images like they were taken with an old camera or a foggy lens. Have you ever seen those photos where everything is out of focus, like someone was shaking the camera while taking it? That's what they looked like. And the worst part was, the setting of the pictures was always the same. A dark place, full of trees, like a forest at night. The first time I saw them, I thought she was trying to play a prank on me, or maybe it was just some weird joke. Then came the voice messages. Only, they were even worse. When I opened the files, all I could hear was background noise, like wind or maybe leaves rustling. But sometimes, if I listened closely, it seemed like there was a voice buried underneath it all. I couldn't make out what it was saying, like someone was whispering really faintly. I tried asking her what was going on, sent her several messages trying to figure out if this was some sort of game, but she just wouldn't reply. Then came another set of coordinates. This time, the location pointed even farther away, to an even more remote spot. Each time, farther from the city. I should have stopped there, should have left this whole thing behind. But something was pulling me in like I needed to know what was going on. It wasn't just curiosity. It was stronger than that. It was like in the back of my mind, I knew something was terribly wrong, and I had to figure out what it was. Deep down, I started wondering if Elisa was even in control of these messages anymore. Had someone taken her phone? Was she trying to send me some kind of signal, a cry for help? The more I thought about it, the worse the scenarios in my head got. Then, one night, I got that final message. Simple, with no other explanation. Just come find me. You know that feeling when you just know you're going to regret doing something? That's exactly what I felt. My stomach twisted, my palms got sweaty, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to go. The next day, I got in my car and went. The GPS pointed me far from the city, down a road I'd never taken before. It was a long drive, full of twists and turns, with barely any cars passing by. The further I went, the more my cell signal faded. Those little bars you barely noticed started dropping, until they disappeared completely. I was alone on the road. After hours of driving, I finally reached the coordinates. It looked like a random spot in the middle of nowhere. No buildings, no streetlights. Just the road, surrounded by trees, thick like a green wall around me. I pulled over and got out of the car. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to use my phone, but, as I expected, no signal. I looked around, trying to figure out why I was even there. That's when I saw something on the ground, half hidden in the tall grass. I walked over, and as I got closer, I realized it was a phone. It was dirty with a cracked screen, but I recognized it instantly. It was Elisa's phone. The same model she showed me in the pictures we used to send each other. My heart started racing. I picked up the phone, and as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just a few meters away, there was a shallow grave. It wasn't deep, like someone had dug it in a rush. I moved closer, not sure what to expect. And that's when I saw it. Inside the grave, there was a body, or what was left of one. I couldn't look for long. It was horrifying. The flesh was disfigured, like it had been exposed to the elements, or worse, like something had happened before. The smell was unbearable. Somehow, at that moment, it all clicked. Elisa, she was dead, and somehow, I'd been led here to discover it. I ran back to my car, got in, and drove away as fast as I could. All I could think about was trying to forget what I had seen. After I left that place, I went back to the city, still in shock from what I had seen. I decided to go to the police and tell them everything, but when I showed them Elise's phone, they couldn't find anything about her. No records, no trace of who she was. To them, it was like she never even existed. But that wasn't the end of it. After that day, I started getting calls from unknown numbers. It was always the same. When I answered, all I heard was heavy breathing on the other end, no words. And then every night I would dream about that place and what was left of Elisa. It was like she was still calling out to me, even after everything. I don't know who or what was behind all of this, but something told me it wasn't over. And somehow, I was tied to it in a way I'd never fully understand or escape. You know when you're just at home, bored, and you start swiping through Tinder just to pass the time? That's exactly what I was doing that night. Scrolling up and down, seeing the same profiles as always, until I came across hers. Mara. The name was kind of unusual, but what really caught my attention was the picture. She had this alternative style, with tattoos on her arms and short, messy hair that gave off that vibe like she didn't even try to be cool. She just was. Her eyes, man, her eyes were the kind you can't look away from. There was something different there. I didn't know if it was the way she looked at the camera or her serious expression, but it grabbed me in a weird way. I decided to swipe right, and it didn't take long before we matched and started talking. At first, the conversation was the usual stuff. Questions about work, hobbies, that sort of thing. But over time, our chats became more frequent. It felt like she got me, like she could touch on topics I usually wouldn't bring up with just anyone. There was something mysterious about her, and I think that's what drew me in even more. After a few weeks of texting, she suggested we meet up. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but by then I was kind of curious. I wanted to see if she was really like that in person. We agreed to meet at a bar downtown, a place I already knew, so I felt a bit more comfortable. I got there a little early, ordered a beer, and kept an eye on the door. Then she walked in. If she was pretty in the photo, in person she was even more striking. But at the same time, something about her didn't seem right. Like her appearance was perfect, but there was something off in her eyes. It was like she never really focused on me. They always seemed to be just a little bit beyond, looking through me, and that made me a little uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things, right? We started drinking and chatting, and the first few hours were normal enough until she started drifting into some strange conversations. Out of nowhere, she began talking about how life was kind of meaningless. Like, I've heard people say that before, but with her it was different. It didn't feel like a philosophical reflection. It felt more personal, almost as if she had really felt it. And the worst part? She started saying how pain was the only true connection between people. We only really understand someone through pain, she'd say. Every time she brought it up, I'd try to steer the conversation back to something lighter, but she always circled back to that point. I kept thinking, what is she trying to do? Is she testing me? Trying to freak me out? But somehow, I couldn't stop listening. I should have gotten up and left, but something about her kept me there. I was starting to feel uncomfortable with where the conversation was heading, but at the same time, something inside me didn't want to leave. I guess the alcohol was making me more relaxed than I should have been. I'd already had a few beers, and Mara seemed completely chill, even though she was drinking at the same pace as me. Then she suggested we go somewhere more private. I hesitated at first. I don't know, it felt weird. Something about that request didn't sit right with me. But at the same time, I didn't want to be the guy who backed out, especially when everything seemed to be going well, or at least I was trying to convince myself it was. The alcohol, combined with her vibe, made me ignore that gut feeling that something was wrong. Come on, it'll be fun, she said with that little smirk I was starting to recognize. I agreed. But instead of taking me to some normal place like a quieter bar or even her place, she led me to a part of the city I'd never been to before. And I knew that downtown area pretty well. It was a pretty far-off, industrial section with old, abandoned buildings. My stomach started to knot up. I asked why we were going there, but she just gave a little laugh and said she wanted to show me something special. I should have turned around and left right then. But again, the alcohol and my curiosity got the best of me. We stopped in front of a large old building. The windows were all shattered, and the only light on the street was coming from a distant, flickering street lamp. The place seemed completely deserted. I looked around and didn't see a single soul. What is this place?" I asked, laughing nervously, trying to shake off the tension that was now starting to take over me. She just smiled again, that smile that now felt more unsettling than ever. "Come on, you like it?" We went in through a rusted door that creaked loudly. Inside, it was pitch black. The only sound was the echo of our footsteps, and I could hear my heart pounding harder in my chest. With every step we took, the silence grew heavier, and I felt more disconnected from the world outside. There was no noise of cars, no people, nothing. She kept walking ahead, and I followed, more out of instinct than any real desire. The only thing guiding me was her shadow moving in front of me. When we got to the center of the building, I saw a dim light coming from a room further ahead. It was a dirty yellow light, the kind you find in places where you probably shouldn't be. The whole place smelled of mold and rust. That's when I realized we weren't alone. Inside the room, there was a group of people. I couldn't see them clearly from where I stood, but they were gathered in a circle, all wearing masks. Not normal masks, like the ones you'd wear at a party. These looked handmade, maybe out of wood or some ancient material. Each one was different, but all of them had something disturbing about them, like they were meant for some kind of twisted ritual. My whole body went cold. "What the hell is this, Mara?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but fear was already creeping through me. She slowly turned to face me, her eyes now darker and emptier than before. "They've been waiting for you," she whispered, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. A wave of terror ran down my spine. I felt panic rising in a way I had never experienced. My entire body froze. I kept looking at Mara, trying to make sense of what was happening, but she just stared at me with that vacant gaze. The room seemed to close in around us, the air getting heavier. Those masked faces turned slowly in our direction, and I swear I could feel their eyes behind those masks, piercing into me. Before I could react, I felt hands grabbing my shoulders, pulling me with a force I didn't expect. I tried to break free, but there were too many hands, dragging me into the circle. They threw me to the floor, and I heard the sound of a door slamming shut, echoing through the walls like a warning that there was no escape. Mara approached slowly, as if savoring every second of this. She knelt beside me, pulling a mask from one of her coat pockets and holding it up to my face. "This is only the beginning," she murmured, with a smile that no longer seemed human. I tried to fight, tried to get up, but soon a cloth was tied around my mouth, silencing me. They began speaking in unison, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. It was like they were praying or invoking something, but their tone was low and sinister. The sound of their voices made the ground shake, and I could feel my heart racing so fast it felt like it was going to leap out of my chest. My vision blurred for a second. The fear was so intense that I could barely think. That's when I noticed something on the floor in the center of the circle. It looked like a drawing, like one of those summoning circles you see in movies, made with some kind of dark liquid or blood. I didn't want to believe it, but at that point, nothing made sense anymore. They were preparing something, and I knew it involved me. I struggled, but it was useless. They held me down with an inhuman strength, and what terrified me even more was the absolute silence between the murmurs. The only sounds were my rapid breathing and the pounding of my heart. Out of nowhere, one of the masked figures approached with a long, rusty knife. The faint glimmer of the blade in the dim light sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to move, but my legs felt glued to the ground. They turned me to the side, forcing my head to face that symbol on the floor. I wanted to scream, but the gag only muffled my desperate sounds. That's when I heard the sirens. At first, I thought they were in my head, but they grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the room was flooded with blue light, and I heard voices shouting commands. The masked figures started scattering, running like shadows. The knife that was about to touch me clattered to the ground, and the hands that were holding me let go all at once. The police stormed in, breaking down the door with a loud crash, and their shouts mixed with the sirens like some kind of salvation. My body trembled as I crawled away, trying to get up, but my legs barely responded. Everything around me was chaos. Cops were running, trying to catch the masked figures who were fleeing through the building. One of them found me on the ground, pulling the gag from my mouth. "You all right?" he asked, but all I could do was nod, still in shock. They helped me up and got me out of there, and the last thing I saw before I left was Mara, standing in the corner of the room, looking at me with that same twisted smile. She didn't run, didn't try to hide. She just stood there, like she knew I'd never be able to forget her. So, after my last relationship crashed and burned, I was in that weird space, you know? You don't want to date, but you're tired of being alone, so you give in. That's when Tinder came into the picture. I had never really messed with dating apps before. Honestly, the idea of meeting random people online kind of creeped me out, but I was bored and lonely, so I downloaded it. After scrolling through a bunch of profiles that didn't really catch my eye, I matched with this girl named Luciana. She seemed, well, perfect. You know those profiles where everything looks almost too good? She had one of those. But hey, she looked real enough. Pictures of her hiking, some from her job as an engineer, and that smile. She had that smile that just draws you in, makes you think she's someone you can trust, someone you want to trust. We started chatting, and everything was cool. No red flags, no weird vibes, just normal conversations. She liked action movies, hated horror, ironic, right? And was into fitness. After a few weeks of talking, she suggested we meet up. I agreed, and we decided on a little coffee shop downtown. Now, I'll be honest, when the day of the date came, I was nervous as hell. It was my first time meeting someone from Tinder, and all those horror stories you hear about online dating were swirling around in my head. But when she walked into that cafe, all those nerves disappeared. She looked exactly like her pictures, maybe even better in person. She had this energy, this confidence, that put me at ease right away. We sat down, ordered some coffee, and just talked. Everything flowed smoothly. We laughed about dumb stuff like the worst first dates we'd ever been on, and even swapped embarrassing stories about our childhoods. At one point, she even teased me about how I fumbled my order with the barista. It was just easy. But then, right as we were about to leave, she offered me a ride home. It threw me off for a second. I mean, I barely knew her, but she seemed so normal, so trustworthy, that I pushed that hesitation aside. What's the worst that could happen, right? The drive home was chill. We talked about our favorite bands, and she even made fun of me for liking cheesy 80s music. We were laughing, but then she asked something that made me freeze for a second. She casually said, "You live alone, right?" I don't remember ever telling her that. I mean, maybe I had mentioned it in one of our texts, but I couldn't be sure. It felt weird, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just making conversation. The ride continued, and I forced myself to relax again. When we got to my place, though, that's when things shifted. Her whole vibe changed. She got quiet, and that friendly energy, gone. It was like she was studying my house, memorizing every little detail. Her eyes darted around, lingering on the front door, the windows, everything. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up on me, but I couldn't. Something was definitely off. I thanked her for the ride, got out of the car, and headed inside. But that image of her staring at my house, it stuck with me even after I closed the door. At that point, I had no idea what I had just invited into my life. When I got inside, I tried to shake off that weird feeling, but it just wouldn't go away. You know that sensation, like someone's watching you? That's exactly how I felt. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, actually. For some reason, the usual routine of tossing my keys on the counter and crashing on the couch felt different. Like I was aware of every little sound in the house. I turned on the TV, tried to distract myself, but my mind kept wandering back to Luciana. That shift in her attitude at the end of the night, it wasn't normal. But I kept telling myself I was overreacting. People get quiet, right? Maybe she was just nervous. Still, something wasn't sitting right with me. It was getting late, so I decided to head to bed. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, and the thought crossed my mind again. Did I tell her I live alone? I couldn't shake it, man. I stood there, staring at myself in the mirror, replaying our conversations in my head, trying to figure out if I ever mentioned it. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. But eventually I just shrugged it off. Maybe she guessed, Or maybe I slipped and didn't remember. I crawled into bed, turned off the lights, and lay there in the dark. My house was usually quiet, but that night, every little noise felt amplified. The creaks in the walls, the wind outside, even the distant hum of the fridge, it all felt like it was closing in on me. I tried to sleep, but I just kept tossing and turning. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A soft scraping sound. I thought it might have been the wind against the windows or maybe a branch outside. But then it happened again. It was sharper this time, like metal dragging against something. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The noise was coming from downstairs. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling. But you know that feeling when you just know something's wrong? That's what hit me. The scraping turned into this soft, almost rhythmic scratching, like someone or something was deliberately making noise but trying to be quiet about it. I got out of bed, my stomach in knots, and tiptoed towards the door. I listened for a second, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from the kitchen. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I didn't want to feel stupid if it was nothing. But then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, heavy steps, like someone was walking, trying not to make too much noise. My heart was in my throat at that point. I took a deep breath and made my way down the hallway. My phone was gripped tight in my hand, ready to dial 911 at the slightest hint of danger. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. The footsteps were clearer now, moving from the kitchen into the living room. I froze. Someone was in my house. My mind raced, thinking about how they could have gotten in. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. But then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Luciana, that weird look she gave my house. She must have done something. Copied my key? Snuck in while I wasn't paying attention? Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't about to confront whoever, or whatever, was downstairs. I backed up slowly, trying to keep my movements as silent as possible, and dialed the police. The operator's voice was calm, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely explain what was happening. She said they'd send someone over right away. I hung up, my eyes locked on the top of the stairs, waiting. The footsteps had stopped, but I didn't dare move. I didn't know if they were still in the house, or worse, if they were coming back upstairs. Every second felt like an hour. The silence was suffocating. Then, in the distance, I heard the faint sound of sirens. The sound of the sirens was a faint glimmer of hope, but it also heightened my anxiety. I could barely think straight. The footsteps had stopped, and the house was quiet again, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. What if whoever was down there decided to make a run for it before the cops showed up? I crept back to my bedroom, staying as quiet as I could, and grabbed a baseball bat I kept in the closet. It felt stupid, but it was better than nothing. I stood at the top of the stairs, bat gripped tight, listening for any signs of movement. My heart raced with every creak of the floorboards under my feet. The sirens got closer, and I could hear the faint chatter of voices outside. Relief washed over me for a second, but I still felt trapped. I couldn't just go downstairs. I had to wait it out, see what was happening first. The police arrived within minutes. I heard their footsteps on the porch and their voices calling out to me. "Sir, are you okay? Can you hear us?" They sounded calm, but my mind was racing. I wanted to shout back, to tell them there was someone in my house, but I didn't want to give away my position. Finally, I mustered the courage and yelled down, "Yeah, I'm up here. There's someone in my house." The officers responded quickly, telling me to stay where I was. They made their way inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I could see the beams moving across the walls, scanning every corner of my living room. The police moved cautiously, checking each room. I stayed frozen at the top of the stairs, listening to their footsteps and the sound of their radios crackling. They made their way to the kitchen first, and I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After a few tense moments, I heard one of the officers call out, "Clear," followed by another voice confirming it. They continued checking the house, moving methodically. I could feel the tension in the air. It was like a tightrope stretched to the breaking point. Finally, they made their way to the living room. I could hear them rummaging through things, moving furniture, and peeking behind the couch. I waited, heart pounding, praying they'd find whoever it was. Then, I heard the door to the pantry swing open. "Sir," one of the officers shouted. "Come down, it's safe." I hesitated for a moment before making my way down the stairs, clutching the bat tightly. I turned the corner into the living room, and there they were, two cops standing next to the pantry door looking a bit stunned. "We found her," one officer said, trying to keep his voice steady. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's in here." The officer gestured toward the pantry. I stepped closer, my heart racing again. What was she doing in there? Was she waiting for me? My mind raced with all the worst-case scenarios. One of the officers opened the door wider, and there she was, Luciana, curled up in a corner, holding a kitchen knife in her hand. She looked completely different, almost unrecognizable. The charm she had during our date was gone. Instead, she looked wild, eyes wide and darting, her hair disheveled. It was like I was staring at a stranger. "Luciana," I blurted out. I don't know why I called her name. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe I was hoping she would snap out of whatever was happening. She looked up at me, a twisted smile creeping across her face. "I just wanted to see you again," she said in a soft, almost childlike voice. My skin crawled. I felt sick. The officers quickly moved in, cuffing her and taking the knife away. "What were you doing?" I asked, still in shock. The officers didn't let her speak, their focus on securing her. As they let her out of the pantry, I felt a mix of emotions, relief that I was safe, but also dread about what she had planned. How long had she been in my house? What if I hadn't heard her? The officers took her outside, and I followed closely behind. It was surreal watching them put her in the back of the police car. She turned to look at me one last time, and for a moment, her expression shifted from madness to something that looked like sadness. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the night. I stood there, heart racing, the weight of what just happened crashing over me. I'd barely escaped whatever she had in mind. I felt lucky to be alive, but I also felt a deep sense of unease settle in my gut. After everything was sorted, I sat down with one of the officers to give my statement. I couldn't help but think about how quickly my life had turned upside down because of a stupid dating app. In the days that followed, I learned more about Luciana, her history, her past victims. I had narrowly avoided being one of them. As I sat there talking to the officer, I felt an overwhelming sense of paranoia creeping in. Every time I heard someone's footsteps outside, my heart would race. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were more people like Luciana out there, lurking behind seemingly innocent profiles, waiting to pounce. From that moment on, swiping on dating apps was never the same for me. I kept thinking, it's not the app itself. It's the monsters hiding behind those perfect pictures, just waiting for the right moment to strike.